Sometimes I think they're overrated, but if you do it right, cheesesteaks can be truly amazing. So jumping right in, let's talk about the meat. Normally restaurants will use ribeyes for their cheesesteaks, and they're usually using a pretty low grade of meat and buying a lot of it so they get it for super cheap. Most of us are looking at $20 to $25 a pound for ribeye, so I opted in for this cheaper chuck steak. And this part's crucial, we need to slice this up as thinly as possible. Throwing this in the freezer for an hour or two will help this firm up and make it a little bit easier to slice, but my knife was super sharp, so I just did it straight out of the refrigerator. We're looking for about this thin or thinner, but just do your best. Once you have the whole thing sliced up, you're just going to throw it in a bowl, and if you're going to be using it soon, you may as well go ahead and salt it now. You can hold off on the salt if you want, but I like to pre-season my meat when I have the time. We're going to set that to the side and move on to our onions. And just a little pro tip about cooking at home time management. I don't need a ton of onions for these two sandwiches, but as long as I'm cutting up and cooking off some onions, I may as well do extra and use those for a dish that I'm going to make tomorrow. Depending on where you live, you might think it's normal for bell peppers or mushrooms to be joining the onions, but up in Philly, they seem to think that onions are the only way to go. So I'm just going to throw the onions in a pan with some oil and salt, maybe quite a bit of both, and let them cook down to my liking. And you can cut the onions as big or small as you want, but this is what mine ended up looking like. Throw those in a container and set them to the side, and we can move on to our cheese. It's a lot easier to just use sliced cheese, but let's make some homemade cheese whiz. Start by shredding up some cheese, or you can just buy it pre-shredded. Any cheese will do, and then we're going to add some milk to a sauce pot. Throw the milk onto a medium heat, and then we're going to talk about a magic ingredient called sodium citrate. This stuff has a number of applications, but one of the most popular is that it helps emulsify cheeses so that when they melt, they don't separate. Measurements for this will be in the description down below, but we're just going to let that milk get nice and warm, and then throw in our sodium citrate and stir it in to dissolve. That'll happen pretty quickly, and then you just throw in your cheese and stir that in until it totally melts into the milk. It might look a little bit runny at first, but it'll thicken as it cools, and if it gets too thick you can always thin it out with more milk, but you're going to want to keep this warm while we move on to the rest of our sandwich. And just to recap, we have our meat sliced and salted, our onions chopped and cooked, some provolone cheese, our cheese whiz, and some bread, which we're going to throw into the oven for just a couple of minutes to crisp up the outside and warm them up. You can slice it now or slice it right before you fill it, but you're going to want to cut it in half without cutting all the way through. Alright, game time. We got our cast iron skillet heating up, and we're going to throw in our meat. In a perfect world, we'd be using a flat top and 2 metal spatulas, but in the home kitchen, we're just going to use the cast iron and 2 spoons. Spread it around and let it cook until it gets a little bit of color, and then we're going to further shred this up with our 2 spoons. Use one to hold the meat in place and the other to pull it apart and shred it up. Good thing we had a backup camera, am I right? When the meat's about 75% done, you're going to throw in your onions, as many or little as you want, and then just stir those in and mix them up. The steam dissipated. Camera 1, camera 2. Camera 1, camera 2. I don't know why, but I quote that from Wayne's World all the time. When the meat's done, we're just going to take it and throw it into our bread. And if it didn't make sense before, it should make sense now why we didn't want to cut the bread all the way through. When all the meat is in the bread, it's time to cover with our whiz. Obviously you can add less than this, but cheese is the first part of cheesesteak, right? It's pretty much the same process if you're going to be using sliced cheese rather than whiz. You know, throw it in, get the color, shred it up, add the onions, mix that up. Forgot to mention with the first one, this is a great time to add fresh cracked pepper if you want it. Here's pretty much the only difference with the sliced cheese is that we want to make sure that we get our meat into a shape similar to the bread and then throw on our sliced cheese. You also want to throw the cheese on when it's still a couple of minutes from being done because the cheese needs time to melt. Yeah, I always find that just so satisfying. Stuff goes into the bread once again, and there you have it. You have your provolone cheesesteak. Now it's just time to cut these bad boys right down the middle and get to eating. We made it. So I gave my girlfriend 1/2 of each, so I also have 1/2 of each. Well, I guess let's take a bite. I went pretty hard on the whiz, and it's really good because of that. I personally usually lean towards provolone, but this is really good. Let's go to provolone. I think I personally still lean towards provolone. Anyways, Philly cheesesteak, I hope you like this one. Hope you learned something. Go try it out. Don't spend too much money, and I'll see you in the next one.